Imagine a storm so powerful, so deadly, it earned the name the White Hurricane. The Great Storm of 1913 is a dark chapter in the history of the Great Lakes. Over the course of several days, a massive storm unleashed hurricane-force wind, freezing temperatures, and towering waves that ravaged ships and shorelines alike. It wasn't just a storm. It was a catastrophe that reshaped the lives of sailors, their families, and the shipping industry itself. In today's video, we'll dive into the chaos and devastation that forever marked the Great Lakes region in November of 1913. Welcome to Shipwreck History. Before diving into the storm itself, it's crucial to understand the shipping industry of 1913. The Great Lakes were the beating heart of North American commerce, serving as critical transport routes for industries like steel, coal, and grain. Each year, hundreds of ships crisscrossed these waters, braving both the volatile weather and treacherous waters to keep the economy running. Shipping was big business, but it also came with enormous risks. By November 1913, the shipping season was winding down. But as vessels raced to make their final deliveries before the lakes froze over, an invisible menace was brewing in the skies. Weather forecasting back then was nothing like today. They had basic barometers and telegraphs, but meteorological tools were limited. When reports came in of high wind speed and changing conditions, it didn't seem all that unusual. Certainly not a sign of the catastrophic force that was about to strike. Unbeknownst to anyone, a perfect storm was forming. The lakes had seen their share of bad weather, but this was something entirely different. Separate massive weather systems converged into one superstorm, and almost no one saw it coming. On November 7, 1913, a storm began to take shape, but its true power was still unknown. As cold Arctic air surged southward, it clashed violently with warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico over the Great Lakes. A perfect recipe for disaster. The result was an immense low-pressure system, creating what meteorologists now call a November gale. At first, conditions didn't seem that harsh. There were moderate wind speeds and choppy waters. But soon, the wind gusts reached hurricane strength, and waves towered over 35 feet high. For the crews out on the lakes, it was becoming clear that this wasn't a typical storm. Reports of ships struggling to maintain control started to trickle in, and captains were left with difficult choices: push forward or turn back. By November 8th, the storm intensified. Ships that had braved storms before were finding themselves overwhelmed. Crew members battled to keep their vessels on course, but the wind was relentless, bending steel and snapping rigging like twigs. As night fell, the storm showed no signs of letting up, and what seemed like a bad storm was quickly turning into a nightmare. Into the following day, the storm continued to intensify, despite a brief lull that brought false hope of the storm subsiding. Wind speeds continued to increase. Walls of water slammed into ships with relentless force. Whiteout blizzards coated vessels in thick ice, while freezing rain turned decks into slippery death traps. For the men aboard, visibility was near zero. They couldn't even see the bow of their own ship. Vessels like the SS Charles S. Price and SS James Carruthers found themselves trapped. These were iron giants of their time, built to withstand storms, yet the Great Lakes were turning them into fragile toys tossed by the waves. Crews were caught in a life-or-death struggle with the elements. As these ships fought to survive, their crews faced unimaginable terror. Men clung to icy railings as their vessels rocked violently. Some, like the crew of the Charles S. Price, faced freezing conditions on the open decks, desperately trying to control their ship, but the storm had no mercy. For many, their fight for survival came to a heart-wrenching end as the waves swallowed their vessels whole, leaving nothing but wreckage behind. As the storm's full force raged across the Great Lakes, more ships succumbed to the conditions. The SS James Carruthers was last seen on Lake Huron, battling waves that towered over 30 feet high. The crew sent out no distress signals, and she vanished entirely, her remains not found until much later. The SS Regina attempted to get to a safe harbor, but ran aground, capsized and sank, leaving no survivors. The SS Charles S. Price was also discovered days after the storm flipped upside down, its hull eerily floating on the surface of Lake Huron. It took time for rescuers to even identify the wreckage, as they had to examine it from underwater. The crew, who had desperately tried to keep the ship afloat, were all lost. Imagine the terror for those on board, knowing there was no way out as freezing water flooded in. It's hard to fathom the helplessness felt by these sailors as their ships were overwhelmed by monstrous waves and icy blast. Other ships, like the Hydrus and the Isaac M. Scott, went down in the unforgiving waters of Lake Huron, along with many other lesser-known vessels like the Wexford. The Henry B. Smith misjudged the severity of the storm, and shortly after leaving port, it went down in the full force of the storm. The wreck wasn't discovered until 100 years later, in May of 2013. One by one, these ships and their crews succumbed to the relentless assault of the storm. Some were never found, leaving families ashore to wonder forever what had happened to their loved ones. The human toll was staggering. In just 3 days, a few hundred sailors perished, many disappearing without a trace. The freezing temperatures and blizzard conditions meant survival was nearly impossible for anyone thrown into the water. Crews faced unimaginable horrors as they fought for their lives, only to be overpowered by the relentless fury of nature. The storm left behind more than wrecked ships. It shattered communities along the lakes. Families lost fathers, brothers, and sons, with many bodies never recovered from the depths of the lakes. This wasn't just a maritime disaster, it was a human tragedy of massive proportions. The wrecks caused by the storm were a grim reminder of how vulnerable even the mightiest vessels were in the face of nature's most violent fury. The rescue and recovery efforts after the Great Storm of 1913 were almost as grueling as the storm itself. The blizzard-like conditions, with near-zero visibility and relentless waves, made it nearly impossible for search teams to reach the ships in distress. In some cases, rescuers couldn't even set out until days after the storm, as the conditions remained treacherous. Once the storm finally subsided, rescuers faced a grim reality. Wreckage and bodies were scattered across the lakes. The first sign of what had occurred was the upside-down hull of the SS Charles S. Price. Wreckage from other vessels began to wash ashore, and it was clear that this was one of the worst disasters the Great Lakes had ever seen. Sadly, there were very few survivors. Most sailors were either trapped inside their ships as they sank or succumbed to the icy waters. One of the few fortunate survivors managed to escape after a ship, battered by waves, ran aground near shore. His account of clinging to wreckage through the freezing night, watching his fellow crewmen disappear beneath the waves, highlighted the sheer desperation of those who tried to escape. Stories like these, though few, capture the harrowing reality of survival in such conditions. For many, though, rescue didn't make it in time, and the wreckage found in the days and weeks that followed painted a grim picture of the storm's deadly power. In the immediate aftermath of the Great Storm of 1913, the shipping industry was left in shock. The loss of 12 ships highlighted just how unprepared the Great Lakes shipping routes were for such extreme weather. For weeks, debris, bodies, and shattered vessels continued to wash ashore. The storm disrupted vital shipping lanes and led to a temporary halt in maritime activity as authorities scrambled to assess the damage. The disaster became a turning point in Great Lakes maritime safety. New regulations were quickly introduced, particularly regarding winter shipping. Ships were required to improve their structural integrity, and more stringent weather monitoring systems were put in place. The lessons learned from this storm forced the industry to adopt better forecasting technology and communication systems, ensuring that such a tragedy would never catch sailors off guard again. The legacy of the White Hurricane still resonates today, as it shaped modern shipping protocols in the Great Lakes. Even a century later, the Great Storm of 1913 continues to captivate maritime historians. Underwater exploration teams have uncovered many of the wrecks, including the SS Hydrus and the SS Isaac M. Scott, still resting on the lake beds where they were lost. These discoveries allow us to better understand the tragedy and preserve the memory of those who lost their lives. The storm's legacy has also influenced modern weather prediction. Advances in meteorology and safety regulations owe much to the lessons learned from 1913. The Great Lakes shipping industry is far more cautious today, especially during winter storms. The story of the White Hurricane is now commemorated in museums and historical exhibitions, reminding us of the ferocity of nature and the resilience of those who brave it. The Great Storm of 1913 remains a defining moment in Great Lakes history, a tragic event that claimed the lives of hundreds of sailors and sank 12 ships. The bravery of the sailors who faced this storm deserves to be remembered, as is the importance of learning from maritime disasters to ensure safer seas for future generations. Let us know in the comments below what you think about this story. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and share, and subscribe to our channel for all things shipwrecks. Until next time, keep exploring.